I guess I haven't got the right to welcome you to country. I hope after this talk you will realise it is Noongar country, and not only that, it's a very special piece of Noongar land that we're on. And I welcome you all, and I hope Alan Kickett here can endorse the welcome, because I haven't got the authority, but Alan has. Yeah, if you don't mind, Alan.
I think the only appropriate thing to do is, if you're in Noongar country, you get a Noongar welcome. I mean, anywhere else you go around the world, you'll probably get shut down. But yeah, we're not like this. Aboriginal people, we are inclusive. We share whatever we've got with everybody, and we don't take more than we can take home, or more than we can carry in our pockets or on our backs. So that way, we Aboriginal people, we are a sharing and we're a caring people. We care for each other, and in our culture, nobody goes hungry. Nobody goes without a roof over their head. But politics have changed a lot of things, and a lot of things have happened in the meantime, and in the meantime, the place has gone crazy. So let's get back on track again.
Thanks, Alan. As I said, Bassendean is a very special place. But it's only when Jenny started researching the history of this place that I became aware just what a special place it was. These are the first two documents she found that referred to incidents in early Bassendean. Both talk about killing. This one, Englishmen killed. Both talk about kangaroos belonging to the Aboriginals. And we can see there that William Dyer with James Henty went out hunting kangaroos. They came across a group of Aboriginal people who insisted they put them down and wouldn't let them go till they had. The second reference she found was a letter written by Jane Dodds. Jane Dodds used to live down near the bridge. She ran the Clycombe Inn, and she wrote this letter. This is part of a letter she wrote back to England. We found it, I think, fairly accidentally, but in fact later on we found a copy of it in the British newspapers. She states that the settlers have been the aggressors, again, that kangaroos belong to the Aboriginals. You have killed our kangaroo, now we must have yours, because they'd pinched a whole lot of sheep. And she also stated that they were killed, many were killed. There were 200 on I think Success Hill, it's certainly very close in this area, wounding many. However, the others fled into confusion, leaving behind the spears in question, and she'd sent home some souvenirs to England. Okay, some other finds. This is about conflict in the Swan, along the Swan River. I found about 8 or 9 of them, but this is probably one of the biggest ones. This is a battle in Perth, May the 3rd, 1830. It's very well documented. There is a report written back to England by the Irwin, and I found the report in the Colonial Office in London. There is a report in the Western Mail written in 1914, and it's remarkable how similar both the newspaper report and the document in London is. American sealers, whalers and others had stayed no longer than a few months on these shores before 1830. On May the 3rd, it seemed all the neighbouring families moved on Perth with the intention of harassing the visitors, hoping they would leave. This account in the 1914 Western Mail is the same incident officially reported by Irwin. Both are very detailed reports of the events that happened that day. It was an all-day confrontation, if you like. By the afternoon, the Aborigines had taken refuge among the reeds in a swamp, which I guess is on Lake Street. The colonists in the 63rd Regiment fired into the reeds from both sides of the wetland, and I quote, "Groans were heard proceeding from the swamp, and was soon made manifest that several natives had been severely wounded." Again, the number of killed is not recorded, but seemingly it was a significant number. Governor Stirling obviously was given the authority to grant land when he arrived here. This is a document he put out to the settlers who were with him in June. Surprisingly, it doesn't say authority to grant land, it says the authority to grant unoccupied land within the aforesaid territory. Now that was a problem because there was not very much unoccupied land here. It may explain why the first 3 months in the colony they set up their first establishment on Garden Island. And these are water paintings of the houses they built there. There's a couple of them that would have been done in the mid-1829. While they were there, they sent out exploratory parties to the mainland, seeing if they could find any unoccupied land, but there was none. I googled Government House to see what they've said about the first Government House because I'd heard that it was on Garden Island. And there, can you read that? The first vice-regal residence was initially a tent camp. It hardly looks like a tent. Set up on Garden Island between June and September 1829. And that's all the sites I looked at had this tents out, but when you look at the paintings, it's a bit more than that. Getting back to the land tenure system, Aboriginal land tenure system. There are many reports on this land tenure system, 1833 in the Perth Gazette, 1836 in a report in the State Records Office, and this one, which is an 1840 report from the Protector, Charles Simmons. Up the top, it reads name and census of natives, original owners of the land. And then it goes on to give the property boundaries. This property ran from Fremantle, the west side of the Swan River to the sea, and up to Mount Eliza. It also gives you the name of the property, which is Kala, not something, Urdal Kala. It gives you the person who was the chief, which is Yalagonga, and the people who lived in that area. The second one, from Mount Eliza, Kings Park, down to Bassendean. And that's the land of Monday. Okay? 15 years before the Mabo decision, Robert Brofo, this is Robert and his wife Edna, Robert Brofo explained Aboriginal property boundaries.
The black man had his law set down. Yeah, he's had his boundaries, which represent the states now. He's had a tree. Each tribe kept to his own surroundings. He didn't go over past that tree or the IEL or a rock because he'd be on somebody else's, on the other tribe's side.
That's right.
What Robert's saying there is that Aboriginal people have their properties and their boundaries they never cross over. It may be trees market, it may be rocks market, but they don't go on to another person's boundary unless they go through the usual protocols that we use when we're visiting next door. We knock on their door, we make ourselves known, and they did the same. While rivers were common boundaries, marked trees like this, of which I found a few along the hills, may have been other markers that mark property boundaries. We know that the boundaries of this property is somewhere in those foothills. Menley Line talked about properties, and very similar to the other one, to Simmons, but he added an additional aspect, which was that there were certain areas which were common land, and one of them was at Bassendean, and that's in Hammond's book. Surprisingly, both Kings Park and Success Hill, which were bits of common land, are now still Crown land. But that didn't happen to all bits of common land. From Pinjarra, for example, that was a bit of common land which is now freehold title. Because it is common land in such a special place, Aboriginal people feel comfortable here. And so you'll go through the ages and you'll find there's always been people here. This is the occasion when Australia became a federation, and the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York visited Melbourne as part of those proclamations, and that was in January. On their way home, they visited Western Australia, and to celebrate the occasion, they invited a whole lot of Aboriginal people from all over the state to put on some sort of show for them. And they all felt very comfortable being at Kings Park. On a personal basis, that is Fred Mead. My grandmother was a Mead, and in old families, come here early to start, it is not uncommon for them to have Aboriginal twigs, I call it, in the family tree. And so Fred is a very, very distant relative of mine. It's not the only Aboriginal relatives I have. I've got a few, but they're sort of married into the family. This is another photograph, 1917. The gentleman on the far left, we believe, is Tommy Nettle. Daisy Bates gave his Aboriginal name as Neetle, N-Y-E-E-T-L-E. In the Spanish census they spell his name Nuttall, N-U-T-E-L. But certainly he's a gentleman who came from the first North tribe, and his family can trace their roots back to the 18th century using Gray's genealogy. I've got a copy of it in my book, but Gray was a person who was shipwrecked up at Sharks Bay, walked back to Perth. A couple of his mates died, but he struggled into, I guess, around Lake Joondalup, nearly dead. They brought him back to life and saved him, and he got all this information from their genealogy, if you like, and published it. So some people are very lucky to know their origins. The other person in this photograph who I found interesting was Adeline Wilkes. Adeline married a Corunna who lived on a farm up in Muckenbooden, but because she came from down here, she always had her children in country. The country, in fact, turned out to be King Edward Memorial Hospital, and when we wrote the history of that place, we had to tell the story that Albert told us. The matron at King Edward, and if I use the word hated, I think that's probably right, hated Aboriginal women coming to her hospital and having their babies. So they quickly learnt that they wouldn't visit it until their babies were ready to drop. And Adeline would have done the same. So she'd take the train down to Perth, stay at a Mrs. Hall's place, and when she was ready, she'd come in to King Edward's. She's about 17 there. And there are numerous articles in the papers about Aboriginal people being on Success Hill. Not always complimentary. At present it is occupied by Aboriginals, and there are many complaints from ratepayers respecting their dogs and the condition of their camps. The people were afraid of an epidemic of disease at any time. And there are lots of those articles. I found a document in the State Record Office that has all the people living in Bassendean at that time named. They'd been ordered to move to the South Guildford Reserve. Remember, about the 1920s, Aboriginal people seemed to have disappeared from the metropolitan area. They'd been shifted up to Magumba, they'd been shifted down to Carrolup, so there weren't many here. But in the 30s, they started drifting back. So these are all the people in the 19th, sort of a census it is, of who was in Bassendean. So we had 3 camps, Beachborough Sanitary Depot Camp and the Ivanhoe Street Camp. And you'll notice Tommy Brophy. It's not a misspelling. He was Tommy Brophy back until about 1947, when his name started appearing in the paper as Brofo. So I don't know how that came about, but certainly after that, the name Brofo has stuck. When the Army took over the South Guildford Reserve in 1942, the department attempted to have Eden Hill area gazetted as a native reserve, but it failed. But even though it failed, the people moved back there and set up their camps. But they not only did that, they actually started buying the land. They had freehold title to the land, and you can see it in the rate books. Louisa Hayden, 1944. If you go back to previous rate books, it'll have the date where she purchased the land on the side. We have Herbert Dyson, 1944. Lottie Grange, I'm not sure whether she was 45 or 44. I'd have to go back to the rate books. Sissy Egan bought one, and Cecilia Headland bought one. certainly 45 there. That one is Douglas Kickett, bought a block in 46, and Mary Morden bought a block in 46. And you can see on the maps where they were. They're along Merry Crescent, and Morley Drive's up the top there. The sanitary depot, can anyone know where the sanitary depot was? It was there. Okay? That's where the night cans were all emptied out. Applications to build their own land. I noticed on the previous block the land areas are 1 to 3 acres. Application to build on their own land resulted in the Road Board querying the legality of native zoning land. So Lottie Grange applied to build a one-roomed house on her block, and they sent Merv Woods off to make some inquiries. Merv was the health inspector. He was very sympathetic of it, because in Bayswater, whenever they put up shacks there, they were knocked down. But Merv was a bit more accepting. When he brought his report back, the minutes stated it was decided to check up with the rate book in regard to the ownership of land, and the Secretary was directed to obtain particulars as to the legality of natives owning and holding land and the position in regard to enforcement of building regulations. And the reply that came back, they're allowed to own land, and you are allowed to insist that they build it to a good enough standard. So Lottie got her house built. She paid for the materials and voluntary labour put it up for her. The Churches of Christ decided to build a hostel up there. You'll notice in one of those things that the Churches of Christ had 3 blocks on Merry Crescent. They took the application to council because they wanted to build it because Aboriginal people often had to visit Perth for medical reasons or to see the Protector. So they wanted a hostel for them. The locals weren't extremely happy with that and put in a petition objecting on the grounds that it was too close to human habitation. The Road Board accepted their argument apparently because they refused the application. It was signed by 95 residents of the district. I think in 1945 this is, at the end of the war. I'd love to know what I should look it up, shouldn't I? How many residents of the district put in an objection. Nonetheless, they built their houses. Merv didn't knock them down. These weren't approved. And this was supposed to be one of the better ones. This belonged to Charlie Nettle and William Worrell. Charlie is the gentleman on the left here. That's Willie Worrell's son Billy. I think that's Willie's wife. The 2 children I know are Headlands. This is a Mippy, an Anderson, and this is, is that a Worrell? Ollie Worrell, that is, I think. Ollie Worrell. Yep, that was their house. And the camps at Bassendean received quite a bit of publicity in the papers. They are in the West Australian, they are in the Mirror. The article in the Mirror concentrates on the fact that even though they pay rates, they don't get anything for it. They pay their water rates, they pay their other rates, their sanitary rates, but they don't get the service. And both papers concentrated on that. They had the land for 10 years. 1944, the last bit of land was sold in 1954. And there were 2 reasons for their selling land. One was Sissy Egan felt compelled to sell because the white fellows were getting too close, you know. But the second one was an unusual reason. The 1950s is known for its incredible inflation because of the wool boom. The wool boom started about 1949. I know that because my dad paid off his debt from the Depression in the 1950s wool boom. And the same thing happened here. Dick Kickett says his father sold the land because the government bought it up. It became state housing. My father bought his block for only £10, but he got £140 for it within about 6 or 7 years. Huge inflation. Now I'll move up to 1977. This is, Alan's involved in this. There was a huge movement in the 70s to have Aboriginal housing. And if you read through the records, you'll see the name of Alan Kickett and Robert Brofo are the two main pushers and shovers, if you like, for this. This is 14th of June. This is 40 years ago today. 40 years ago today, the Brofos packed up their tent in Widgie Road and moved to Lockridge. So I think that's Herbert and Harvey. Would I be right, Alan?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. In a couple of months prior to that, someone burnt one of their camps down in the polo ground in Guildford. So they put up 7 tents in Stirling Square near the church St Matthew's in a protest to draw attention to the, terrible state they were in. They couldn't get housing, although they could get housing. Some got state housing, but one of the problems was when one of the family got a state housing commission, all the relatives moved in. Robert Brofo had a house in Ashfield. He had it for over 3 years, but by the time his cousins and just his sisters and stuff moved in, there were about 20 people living there, and so they were evicted. Okay, it's a discussion about where are we going to go.
That's honest.
But where are you going to move to?
Where can we go? That's my problem. Where can we go?
Big question mark, is it?
Where can we go? We might go and sleep up in a tree like a crow.
Their move to Lockridge was met with some hostility. On June the 13th, they were expected, the Swan Shire was expected to pass a motion allowing them to move up to Lockridge. That had all been worked out. And then a petition came in from the residents of Lockridge opposing the move. So the council deferred their decision so that they could have a public meeting to consider the complaints of the residents. After the council made this decision, the people who had been sitting in Stirling Square for 53 days decided they'd had enough, so they moved up to Lockridge. So they arrived at Lockridge today, 40 years ago. But before the public meeting took place, Brofo and his family decided to take advantage of the fact that the Federal Labor Party was having a conference at the Hyatt Hotel. So they lobbed there and asked permission to speak. They were refused, so they just sat in the middle of the floor for the rest of that day. He went up and he said to a journalist after, "This is a white man's way of boundary riding while his problem is in the middle of the paddock. I just wanted to ask the conference why we are still living under the trees and if there is any future for our children. I'm just a third-class Australian who wanted to make a simple speech." So he met, there's papers, photographs of him in the paper talking to Bob Hawke, about speaking the next day because they're going to talk about Aboriginal stuff. But that was knocked back. This is 1981. I've got 4 names up there. Lindsay and Morris Narrier, George Pickett and Morgan Edgell were having a meal in Stirling Square when they were attacked by 3 young men and a 16-year-old boy armed with lengths of wood. The boys had decided to go out some boom bashing on a Friday night, and that's in this judgment here. I'll talk about that in a minute. 42-year-old Morgan Edgell died 3 days later, and the 4 were charged with murder. But only Anthony Pike was found guilty and received a life sentence. The Crown appealed the sentence given to the other 3, and on appeal they were given sentences for 4 to 6 years. Randall then appealed that because he said I was a Johnny-come-lately to this bashing, and he had his sentence reduced to 18 months because he wasn't one of the planners at the start. Their time at Lockridge, this is 13 years. I've been there 13 years when this article appeared in the paper. Things had improved a bit. They were out of their tents and they were in the cabin mostly. There were still a few tents there. But they manage, every time something gets in the paper, they always manage to get an article in. See that bit over there, that article? This is saying land is the key issue, and we don't want land freehold to individuals. We want it to own it as a community, and we want to build the houses the way we want them built. And that was a theme from 77 right through, a continual theme. They weren't without their deaths. This is Bella Brofo's daughter died when she was 2. But in 1994, Richard Court gave them title to the land. And they were extremely happy. At least now they could do something. But then they discovered they had to go through all the rezoning things to be able to build their hand, and they became a bit frustrated. And they vented their anger in various ways. The young fellow, Peter Mowes, I think that is.
Earth is it's no different from mixing concrete, but except it's just gravel and clay. It started off with the walls first, basically the wall, then we put on the roof, and we do everything inside, outwards, the ceiling, insulation, and the walls and all that. We do it on the inside, plus the bathroom. The showers and the bathroom are separate from the house, so we build those up at the same time. Sometimes we do one or two houses at once, you know, part-time here and part-time here. We build about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I say about 10 houses. You name it, we can do anything to do with the building trade, we can whack it up.
And whack it up they did. They put up 11. This is their office. Whenever you go there, that's the first place you go to, or did go to. This is the archives. They have about between 20 and 30 metres of documents they kept over the years, kept in that part there. Notice in the background, there are 2 wind generators. Not only did that supply power to their houses, it also was one of their big sources of income because it feeds into the grid. And when that was opened in '98, they were very, very happy. All their dreams had come true. They were extremely happy. It was a great day. But then there was trouble. In 1999, Susan Taylor was found hanging in the old ablution block. The old buildings hadn't been knocked down yet, with a garden hose around her neck. At the time of her death, Robert Brofo was in Brisbane, waiting to board a plane home. He had been at Senator Neville Bonner's funeral. When told on arriving home, he stated, "We will get the blame for this." And he didn't know how right he was. The 2001 inquest created massive adverse publicity. When you read through the newspaper articles now, you notice how very short on detail they are. Articles like this did nothing to change the news. This is a classic piece of misinformation. There are 2 articles here. The one on the right is about the inquest and Brofo denying the abuse claims. The one on the left is about Mr McGarry, a paedophile who has been set free. And now, this is a fairly extreme example of the misinformation in the press, but there were stacks of it. The inquest resulted in the Gordon inquiry, and the inquiry was into the way government departments interact with their Aboriginal clients. The duty of the Gordon inquiry was to look into Susan Taylor in particular and their relationship with government departments. The inquiry made no adverse findings about the Swan Valley Noongar community, and there was, in the 170 odd recommendation, there was only one about the Swan Valley Noongar community, and that was for the government to negotiate a memorandum of understanding about access to the community. So where this stuff came from. This comes from, this is in Parliament. It's come straight from Hansard. Gallup decided to close down the camp because of ongoing sexual abuse in the community, and also because he stated that there was kids were being supplied with alcohol and intoxicants. Anyone who's been there around that time will know that last one is definitely untrue, because Herbert had taken upon himself the responsibility of making sure kids never came to the camp with that stuff. Anyway, it passed through Parliament. The lower house approved it. The upper house, this is a Sunday Times article, so the lower house has approved it at this stage. The upper house is to debate it in a couple of days' time. So Brofo decided to dictate a letter, send a letter to all the members of the upper house, saying that I want an inquiry into the allegations that Gallup has made.
And the inquiry says that Jeff Gallup was wrong, then you too will be blamed, along with him, for false allegations. Let us remind you that what Colin Barnett said on the 6PR radio station in company with that Paul Murray, that men were having sexual intercourse with boys here on this community with no factual evidence. And if this inquiry took place and found him wrong, then you would be wrong too in making a decision.
I'm only up to with no factual evidence.
Then you would be wrong in making this decision before an inquiry took place. We'd like to ask you that you can make a decision only then when the inquiry is completed. Either way, the benefit of the doubt's been given to you now. If you accept an inquiry to take place, then you will be doing the rightful thing. Because out of that will come the real truth, the other side. Has to be told.
Okay, so only 8 of the Legislative Council members voted against the bill, so it went through. They were kicked out of their community, but Robert Brofo, for those who can remember, took his bed and put it up on the steps in Parliament House, above the steps, just to the left of the door. He stayed there until the Legislative Council agreed to hold an inquiry into their eviction. And the result of that was the Foss report, the Foss inquiry. This is the report of it. And it rebuts most of Gallup's claims. Chapter 15, it's online, this, you can read this. Chapter 15 addresses the abuse claims. 2 of the 3 examples given as evidence of abuse turned out to be false. One of those, there was only 1 sexual abuse claim. That was proved to be false, and the 3rd one could not be substantiated. The earlier chapters in this report investigate how department heads passed hearsay material to the Premier's department. It's an interesting read. The only department that came out fairly clean in this was the police department. The police had a fairly good contact with the Aboriginal community. And in fact, it was so good that whenever police picked up Aboriginal kids on the streets and couldn't contact their parents, they brought them to the Swan Valley Noongar community until such a time as their parents could get them. Susan Taylor's death was not put forward as an instance of abuse. The report finishes with 11 summary statements, and I've got one of them here. This is number 10. It can be argued that the residents were more fortunate than many fringe dwellers. They had housing of significantly better standard than most. The majority of their children had a good record of school attendance. They had other facilities that were better than generally available. They had sound financial management, and they had better access to many government services. These they have lost. As a group, they have been scattered, and scattered they were. No matter that there were dysfunctional aspects to their community, they remain dysfunctional, but now are separated from a very important element of Aboriginal culture, communal living and its associated support structures. Okay, this is the last time these houses were lived in. This is taken on the 8th of June. They were out on again, today is such a magic day. This is the day that they were kicked out officially. And this is their houses. They've never been lived in since. 2 years ago, they protested they'd often protested on the steps of Parliament House, wanting their houses back. On this occasion, 2 years ago, they protested on the Friday, I think, and on Monday the bulldozers were moved in to clear all them. The only thing that remains is the gate. These are I've got 3 books to do in this series. These are the first 2. And they're like my talk, they're just documents. I am not a writer like my wife, so, you know, I just publish documents. The first one is about their ownership of land and the consequence of losing it. The second one is about the Eden Hill camps and a lot of the legislation that applied only to Aboriginal people. It created some remarkable stuff, like a prisoner of war guy down in Donnybrook got an Aboriginal girl pregnant, and he was taken to court for cohabiting. And as his lawyer said, this man in Italy has never heard of these laws. This man did not know until November last of the law relating to natives. No such law exists in his country, but he still got convicted. The third book is going to be called The Records of the Swan Valley Noongar Community. So much stuff to sort out. Picking out documents that, you know, is just so hard. So the money goes to the community. Anyway, thanks.